this video, I'm going to do part 2 of Blender interface and navigation. I know it's been a while, but I have just made an update video about a month ago if you want to check that out on what's been going on with me. So anyway, I just want to jump into it because I want to try to keep this as short as possible. Again, I'm not an expert with Blender, I'm just an average creator who is using this program to create for SL, and most of what I explain is in kind of a brief easy version way because I don't know all the technical aspects of the program or of mesh, but I did the best I can learning on my own, so I just want to share what I know in a pretty easy basic way, hopefully to understand for others out there who are just getting started or want to jump over to using mesh. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is something I forgot to mention in my first Blender video, and that is user settings. At the top of your screen, if you go to File, User Preferences, and this is the area where you can put add-ons into Blender, such as Avastar, or you can activate ones that are already there by just checking the checkbox and then click Save User Settings. You can play around with the other tabs in here. They can control how you set up your mouse and your hotkeys and everything that you use to navigate through Blender. So user preferences, and just a note, to add an add-on in Blender, you go to Install Add-on from File button at the bottom, and then you would just find the file on your computer and like in your Downloads folder probably, and then click Install Add-on from File. And that's how you get it in Blender and save user settings. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about before I get into other tools and things is something called backface culling. So when you're in SL and you have, I'll just use clothing for example, if you look underneath the dress, the white dress, there's no lining underneath, and the faces of the mesh on the back are invisible because there are no mesh faces on the inside of this dress. So, but luckily we can see when that happens in SL, and as opposed to the black dress underneath, the creator put mesh faces on the inside to create a lining, so that's why you don't see any invisibility there. That's in Blender there is something that lets you see if your mesh has a backing or not, and that's called backface culling. And I'll show you an example here. I'm just going to use the basic cube and go into Edit, face select mode, right click and delete the face. And as you can see from this view, which is default view, or the default setting, it looks like I have mesh faces inside the cube even though I don't. These faces, at least in terms of uploading to SL, are not really there. So if I hit N and let me turn on my screencast keys. So if I hit N and it'll open up this panel on the inside right of my screen. I go to scroll down and go to backface culling. As soon as I turn that on, it's going to show me the true inside of this cube, whether there are mesh faces in there or not. And as of right now, there are not. The faces only have one side right now, and that's on the outside. So if I did want, and I'll show you this other tool in a minute, but if I did want to create a lining inside or create mesh inside, one quick way to do it is spacebar, type solidify, and then hit solidify, and it just added a thickness and a lining inside the cube. And on the left you have a little slider that you can increase thickness. But so that's solidify, which I kind of just talked about it, so I don't have to do that later. Anyway, so that's backface culling. I mean, you can work however you would like to, but I like to work with backface culling on so I can see where my faces need to have a backing. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is advanced selection. So I'm just calling it advanced selection, and they're just other tools, ways you can select your mesh. So far we learned A for select all, deselect, and we learned L for hovering over a part of the mesh. If you had multiple objects in this same edit scene, you could use L to select one of the pieces in your scene. So I'm going to deselect everything and go to the side here, and I'm going to add some loop cuts, which I'll introduce in a minute, so don't worry. So in other words, I have extra faces here, and I don't want to spend time holding shift and selecting all of the faces I want. That just takes longer. So if I wanted to, I could hit C for circle select and then use my middle mouse wheel to scroll up or down to change the size of the selection cursor, and now I can just kind of like left click and paint on my selection. So it's an easier way to select multiple faces at once. So that's C for circle select. Another is B for border or box select, as I call it, and that is useful when you have a bunch of mesh on different sides of your, say, cube in this case, and you want to select parts at a time together without turning around, or if you just want to use the drag selection style to select something like an SL in World, it's the same, works the same way. You type B, and then you hold your left click and drag over the mesh that you want to select, and it will just choose anything in the view. I'll talk about something else in regards to that in a minute. So that was B for border or box select. And then another selection, a way to select is inverse. So say that I don't want to select, let me just hit all to select all, A to select all. And then if I were to, let's say I want to select all of these faces on the cube except for this one that I have selected here. Instead of selecting all of the faces around it, I can just select the one I want to delete and then go to select and inverse or control I, and then I can, well, I said that wrong. Say that I want to get rid of all the mesh surrounding this face. This is an easier way to do it without having to select all those individual faces. You would just invert the selection, and then now I can hit X and delete faces if that's what I wanted to do. And then I can hit Control I to flip the selection back around to that one face. So inverse is a useful, it's the same concept as using inverse selection in Photoshop or Illustrator or GIMP, if GIMP has that. The next thing I want to talk about is something basic that I should have mentioned in the first video. That is rotate. So let's say I have my whole cube selected and I just want to rotate it. If I hit R for rotate, it starts to rotate, but if I wanted to constrict it to a certain axis, X, Y, or Z, I would hit R and then type the axis that you want to limit the movement to. So if I want it to stay on the Y, the green axis, I could just hit Y and it'll only spin around that axis. RX, it'll go around the X, and RZ, it'll go around the Z. So that's rotate. And if you want to do it at a certain angle, a certain degrees, you could hit R, Y, 90, and it will just automatically rotate it 90 degrees on the Y axis. So that's pretty useful. And then the next is S for stretch or scale. And if I hit S, you see, and I just hit nothing else, it'll scale up the whole thing proportionately. If I want to scale it on a certain axis, I hit S and let's say Y, for example, then I can stretch or scale it on the Y, or S and X, same thing. And you can also put a numeric value, so SX 10, say for example, we'll give it an automatic size of 10, whatever that means, whatever unit of measurement you're working in. So that is scale or stretch. And then the next thing I want to talk about is, okay, extrude. This is one of my favorite tools to use when I'm modeling. It's a way to get extra faces in geometry and just start, building out your mesh. So if I select a face in face select mode, which the select modes are down here, and I hit E, I can pull out this face and I just created more sides. So it's a pretty useful tool in modeling. Just be careful that you don't get hidden faces that you can't see, but that is extrude. So it's a great tool to use. And if you ever, again, when you use most of these tools like extrude or rotate or scale, You can, if you want to get something to, move along a certain axis, you can say hit E and then say I wanted to hold it to the Y axis, which it already is on the Y. You can hit Y or E and X, and then you can hit X, and it will stay on the X axis, or E and Z, and it will stay, on the Z axis. So there might be a situation where you need to do that. So just so you know. So that is extrude. The next thing I want to talk about is, and I will start with a fresh cube. So X for delete menu and delete vertices to get rid of them all, and then Shift C just to center my view back on, and my cursor back on the center of the grid. Shift A to add a cube, a new cube. So I'm going to show you how to do get more lines or faces and edges into your mesh. That is done through what are called subdivisions or edge loops or loop cuts. So to achieve that, the shortcut is Control R. When you hit Control R and you hover over your mesh where you want to make the cuts, you get a purple ring. And if you use your middle mouse wheel, you can scroll up or down to choose the number of cuts you want to make at one time. If you want to go ahead with that, you left click twice to confirm, and now your cuts are made and they are edges and faces that you can work with. Or if you want to, say you make the cuts and you want to cancel, just click right and say never mind. Or if you want to make, say, one, and then you want to slide it up or down on the mesh, you can left click and then slide it up and down to place it where you want if you don't want it exactly center. So that's loop, cut, and slide, and the long way to get to it is the tools panel on the left side. Scroll down until you get to loop, cut, and slide. That's just another way to use the Control R function. So that's to create edge loops. Another way to get equal divisions of your mesh all the way around without having to do them manually is subdivide, and that button is in the tools panel as well. It's right here. Click subdivide as many times as you want and you will get multiple cuts in your mesh that are equally distributed. So that can be useful when you need to get a lot of faces in and you don't want to take the time to do it manually. So just keep in mind, the more you subdivide, the more mesh there is, the more vertices and edges and geometry, and the higher your prim count could be in the end when you upload it. So, try to keep that in mind. Another useful tool is merge. So if you want to combine two points or edges or whatever together, you can use merge. So if I go into vertices select here at the bottom and choose this vertice and this one, holding shift I selected both, and then if I hit Alt M, I can merge them either at the first selected point, the last selected point, or the center. Let's just do center, so that's center. Or Alt M and choose at first. It'll just combine them at the first point I selected. Or Alt M and merge at last. We'll merge them at the last vertice I selected. So a very useful tool is merge, and that can help reduce prim count too, getting rid of some vertices if you don't need them or whatever. The next feature is sometimes when you're working with a lot of points or vertices and things can be hidden, you get double vertices or double geometry and you don't know. So a good thing to do is select all and then come to the left side in the tools panel and find remove doubles and click it. And at the top here it'll say removed fill in the blank vertices. So here it removed 0 because I didn't have any doubles. If there are any doubles hiding in there, it will tell you how many it removed, and that can help cut down on your prims as well. The next thing I want to talk about is bridge edge loops, which is pretty cool. It's an easy way to fill in gaps with faces if you don't want to do it manually. So let's say that I select this whole row of faces, which was holding the Alt key. I hovered over the horizontal line on this row, and so Alt, and then I right click on the horizontal line. It will select the whole edge loop around that cube of faces, and then hit X, delete faces, because I only want to delete the faces, and now you see I have a gap here. So let's say that I want to fill this gap without having to go and do individually select the vertices and then hit F to fill. That's the basic way to create a face, but let's say I don't have that time and I just want to do it more quickly, I can go to Edge Select down here and go Alt and just right click on the edge of this loop, hold Shift and right click on the edge of that loop to select them together, and then spacebar and then Bridge Edge Loops, and that will fill in the gap all the way around with faces again. So Bridge Edge Loops is pretty useful. And let's see, oh, I mentioned solidify, so that was, again, if you have a hole in your mesh or you have an underside that you want to create faces, such as the lining in the dress. Select all and then hit spacebar and type in solidify, and that will give you mesh inside of your shape. And you can control the thickness of the solidify effect on the right, and the thickness bar, just slide it up or down. So that's solidify, which I use often. Next I want to talk about the shading tab, which let me delete this and put in a sphere. So Shift A to create a UV sphere. As you can see, with the more line loop cuts you have, the more edges you have in geometry, the smoother the cube looks, the sphere, sorry, the smoother the sphere looks. But let's say you want to cut down on prims in the end, and let's create another sphere with less rings around. And I'm going to bring it down, and so it's going to get more blocky looking. So let's say that you wanted to work with this, but when you go into object mode, you can see all the lines. They look very crisp, and it just looks really bad and blocky. So if we want to kind of mask this, there's an illusion that you can create with shading, and if you go back into Edit and go to Shading tab on the left panel and go Smooth Faces, it will get rid of the lines. They just won't be visible on the edges of those loops, so it looks more smooth. And this is a good way to do if you need to create a bunch of spheres in your object, like say a pearl necklace or something that's not going to be seen up close, and it doesn't need to have a bunch of geometry to look smooth. That's one way to do that. And then if you want to get something back to flat to look sharp on the edges, just click the flat button instead of smooth over in Shading tab. And this is useful for like square shaped objects and boxes and things like that. You don't want them to always look smooth, so just use your judgment on that. And then I want to talk about faces and normals, since we're already in the shading tab. In the shading tab, let's say for example you have a face that is appearing to be invisible, but you don't know why because it's there. You can select it. This is what it could look like if you need to get it flipped back around, because as of right now the normal would be facing inside the sphere, whereas all the other ones that are visible, the other faces, their normals are facing on the outside of the sphere. I'm not getting too technical about what normals are. I just want you to know that you can flip the direction of the face to see it again. So if you go in the Shading tab and select the face and hit flip direction, then you can see the face again. Let's say another way is to do, you're having problems with faces on your mesh and you're just not sure what it is, you can hit select all and hit recalculate, and it could possibly just do a simple fix if the normal was flipped. So that is useful. The next feature I want to talk about is really cool. It's proportional editing, and I won't do anything too in depth, but I'm going to add the cube again, and I'm going to subdivide it back in Tools just to get some even cuts around. And proportional editing is a quicker way to edit faces, multiple faces at a time, if you want to create more organic forms on your mesh without having to pull each, say if I want to create a bump here, I don't want to go in and have to pull each face out. If I want to do that more smoothly and easily, I can use proportional editing. So I'll select this face at the bottom, or using hotkey O. Okay, I'm not sure why my O key isn't working. But anyway, it's this little circle down here. Click Enable. Or I like to work with connected, and I'll show you the difference in a minute. So if you choose connected, proportional editing is active, and when you have the face selected or vertice or whatever you're working with, hit G for grab, and then you have middle mouse wheel to scroll the size of the radius of the editing, like the size of the area you want to affect with this tool. If I do it small, as you can see when I pull out, it's going to only pull the faces out within that small radius. If I hit G and then increase the radius, middle mouse wheel, and now I drag out, it's going to affect a larger area within that radius. So um, the difference between connected and enabled is if I had another cube here next to this one, so Shift A to add another cube and slide it out. So let's say that this cube had some geometry too, and I want to edit one of these faces on the edge here, and if I just have it on enable in proportional editing, it will, and then I say G for grab, and then I choose a radius that's pretty large, it will affect any of the faces within the radius on any of the objects in your editing scene. So if I don't want that and I only want to affect this cube on the left, then I would go to connected, and it will only affect the mesh that is connected to this cube you have selected on. So when I do my editing now, it doesn't matter what size my radius is, it's only going to affect the cube I'm working on. So that's the difference between those. I don't use the other ones too often, projected. I don't really use that. So, but you can play around with it. So that's proportional editing. And then I want to talk about occlude, which is, say you have a piece of mesh like this cube with a bunch of faces all around the sides, and you don't want to always turn around your camera to see what's going on. You can click this dotted box down here that's, when you hover it, it says limit selection to visible. This is called occlude, and when you click it on, you can see through your mesh, so you can see through the other lines and geometry around the other sides. And this can be useful if you want to make like a selection of all faces around that particular row or something, and you don't want to turn your camera. So if you hit B for border or box select and then drag your selection, because you had occlude on, you can select all of the faces through the back too. So that can be useful. Just be careful when you're editing them, because when you click, you can select faces that are through to the other side as well, and you might be selecting the wrong thing. So use it with caution, but that's occlude, and then you can turn it back off. And then I want to talk about something called clipping, which if you have some detail work you're working on and you want to zoom way in and you just can't seem to get in enough to work on something without this happening where part of your mesh disappears, it's because the camera is blocking that part of the mesh and it's clipping away the view there. So to fix that and be able to see detail closer, hit N and go to the panel on the inside here and go up until you see clip under the view panel. So if you under the start field, if you click to the right and increase it, it will increase the amount of clipping. If you click to the left and go down and decrease it, it will give more of your view back. So that's something helpful to know. I used to hate zooming in trying to work on detail, and I couldn't get in far enough without the camera clipping, so that helps. So that's clip. And then the last thing I want to talk about is layers. So if you've ever worked in Photoshop or Illustrator or GIMP, you know the concept of layers. They work the same way in Blender. If you go into object mode, whoops, I'm in the wrong menu. Object mode, you see layers, boxes pop up at the bottom of the screen, this little grid area, and there's an orange dot on the first one. That's because we're on layer 1. If we were to separate, say, these cubes and I want to move one to another layer, I go back to edit and make sure everything's deselected, hit L and select this cube on the right, and then if I go to P for separate by selection, it's now a separate object. So if I go back to object mode and select that cube, I can go hit M, and click on the second layer box, and now that cube is on the second layer. So that's layer 2, and then this is layer 1. So it can be useful to be able to separate your objects onto different layers for various reasons, such as creating clothing sizes, different clothing sizes for a dress or something like that. Or I've done my LODs on different layers in this way before for an object. Um, so it's good to know, and you don't have that means you don't have to go and create a separate Blender file to work on something if you don't want to. So that is pretty much it for the part 2 of the basics, very, very basics of Blender interface and navigation. I do believe in explaining these things before jumping into modeling any kind of projects, because the more familiar you are with how to get through Blender and the interface, the easier it will be for you to accomplish anywhere from a simple to a really complex project that you want to work on. So um, that's it. If you have any questions or comments or anything like that, leave me a message either on YouTube or in my Facebook or under Erie Ember or in World as well, but I go in there infrequently, so that's the last way that I would recommend to contact me, or you can email me and I will leave all of that information in the description because I love to hear from you guys and I also love your comments and support for each other learning. So again, I'm not an expert in Blender, but this is just my basic, quick way of showing how I learned to do these things, and hopefully it will help someone out there. And if it's not enough for you, or it was too fast or brief, there are loads of other videos that will fill in where I don't know or didn't present more technical information on some of these tools. So that's it, and I will see you in the next video, which will be UV unwrapping and texturing. Thanks. Bye.